step back from the podium and have a seat, though. Thanks. Mr. Wald for the Select Board.
Thank you. I move to refer this article to the Select Board and the Jones Library trustees.
You may speak to your motion.
Thank you. I shouldn't have to say it's obvious. We share with the petitioners an admiration for this library, a love of the building and its functions, and a desire to make it more available to more people more of the time. Just not this way, and I'll explain why. It's a beloved institution. It serves important purposes for North Amherst residents. I know it was transformative in the life of our own daughter, so there's no question about that. The needs cited are very real, but both the needs and the means of satisfying them are rather more complex than the present motion allows. You're going to hear us speak about process. You'll probably hear others say, why are they focusing on process? We don't need process. We think we do, and we're going to tell you why. If you let me explain. We're not about process here for the sake of process. We're talking about process because we work in town government. We see the entire array of services and expenditures. We see how things get done here, and we think that there are reasons not to act precipitously in this case, and instead to follow our normal paths. Process is not an end in itself. Process exists for very specific reasons: transparency, rationality, predictability, and fairness. There have been questions about fairness, for example, in the current funding of capital projects. As you know, there's a long list of things we're trying to get done, very expensive projects, and for years people would say, what about the fire station? Then along came important opportunities to get state funding for the library and for the schools. We're not acting on those right now, but be that as it may, people were wondering why those got to jump ahead of the line, so to speak. And there were good reasons, because funding was available. Sometimes that happens. But the more that we erode that sense of predictability, especially in a tough budget year with major capital projects online, the more complicated things become. There are also questions of substance that arise from the process here. For example, this well-intentioned article focuses ad hoc on a single issue, really, the one of accessibility writ large. We would submit to you, you cannot really examine that in the absence of other questions. One obvious one mentioned was the whole configuration of the intersection. That's a major issue. The town bought the adjoining property in order to regulate the traffic flow, but also to redesign the civic core there, which we saw in the North Amherst planning process, to make the library a more functional space, probably with a larger expansion. Who knows what we have in mind for the library? That's part of the problem. This is just one part of a bigger picture. There's also the question of the existing building as such. The article refers to unused or poorly used spaces, the basement and the attic, or second floor, as you will. This is fine, but to us it does not make sense to tackle the question of access to the building without tackling the question of program. In other words, how is the building going to be used? For what purposes? What functions? How does it fit with the library's core mission and delivery of services? That's something only the library can determine. The library staff, the library trustees. They should be part of this process at the beginning, or it should come from them in a sense. It should follow. We think this is putting the cart before the horse. As you heard, it's also a historic structure. It is indeed. It's what we call a contributing structure in the North Amherst National Historic Register District. So it's a very important building. It's iconic. And we'd be very reluctant to make major changes to the building envelope despite the sincere promise to be as judicious as possible, again, without taking into account the larger configuration of the intersection, the roadway, the civic core, and the uses of that building. What's going to happen when you get inside that door, that elevator, and so forth. There's also the question of expense. You heard a long list of noble things that are being proposed here, from elevators to sidewalks. People we've talked to have said that's easily $1 million job, if nothing else. There's no money for that right now. In other words, if and when we do decide to make these well-intentioned and probably needed changes, the issue is going to come to you and to town meeting. But before that, it's got to go through the Joint Capital Planning Committee through that process. So it seems to us but logical that a request for the study and its funding should also begin there with the Joint Capital Planning process. And in conclusion, let me just say one word about that process. I know that we have a very open system of government here, both thanks to the open meeting law and the way we do business, and that we have these public meetings. You can go to these meetings, you can read about them, you can see some of these on TV, and yet we realize in the Select Board, we realize that people in the public often feel left out, either confused or objectively excluded for a variety of reasons. And to be fair, the joint capital planning process is perhaps the most vexing of these because unlike other ones in which there's a citizen commission, this one is driven largely by department heads. They come to the town with budget requests through the joint capital planning process. And we realize that's hard for you to deal with, and we'd like to try to remedy that too. So part of our proposal, as in the case of social service spending, which we took up earlier this year based on town meeting actions last spring, would be to examine not just the proposal itself, but the way that we can make the joint capital planning process more transparent, more accessible to citizens. So again, while supporting the intentions behind this, we think we're all better served by the referral for the aforementioned reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. So the motion